In the big city, it's nice to know your sister is watching out for you. No matter how late you're working. But despite how safe you think you are, you can never know if someone else is watching you too. A concerned sister. An empty office. Lead police to the horrible truth. In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours.
At approximately 4 a.m., I received a phone call to attend a homicide scene at 94 Cumberland in the Yorkville area of downtown Toronto. En route, I received some information that the victim was Lisa POSLUNS, a female, approximately early 30s. There was evidence of a lot of blood pooling around her. You could see areas where it looked like somebody was dragged through the blood.
She has been stabbed repeatedly. Her throat has been slit.
It didn't appear at first look that this was a sexual assault, but it looked quite odd that the sweater was inside out.
Her belt is undone. Her bloodied jacket has been placed over her head. Something else catches Grady's attention.
I could see a footprint in the deceased's blood.
While ident officers comb the scene for more clues, Detective Grady heads up to Lisa's 5th floor office.
The office was pristine. It was uncluttered, it was very neat, and her cell phone was at the desk.
Lisa's purse and wallet are missing. Grady wonders if this could be a robbery gone wrong. Lisa's sister, Helen, has been waiting for news all night.
This was a rather devastating experience for the family of the POSLUNS.
We were in absolute pieces. We couldn't imagine anybody who would have wanted to harm Lisa.
During the interview with Helen POSLUNS, I find out quite a bit of information about the deceased, her lifestyle. She was a real estate agent who did corporate real estate.
She was an incredible businesswoman. She was smart, she was ethical, and she was the best negotiator her clients ever had.
But commercial real estate is a high-stakes business, especially in upscale Yorkville.
There was an associate who the deceased had dealt with on a regular basis. There were rivalries within the real estate world.
Lisa had filed lawsuits against her former business associate, Nam Lakins. There were hard feelings. Grady asks Helen to call him if she remembers anything else. In the utility room, the ident team continues its investigation. They find a perfect thumbprint. Forensic examination of Lisa POSLUNS' clothing reveals several small stains. When they are analyzed, police get their first strong lead.
DNA, not of the deceased, was located on her underwear, and her pants. We established this was quite likely a sexual assault. We knew the donor of that DNA was going to be our suspect for the murder of Lisa POSLUNS. The problem was to find out who the donor was.
72 hours into the investigation, police have 3 pieces of evidence: a bloody footprint, a thumbprint, and the DNA of the killer. Detective Grady assigns Constable Helen DIXON to the case.
My role was to interview people who had known the victim and obtain a consent DNA sample from any men that she had contact with.
One of these men is Lisa's former business associate, Nam Lakins. He agrees to the swab. With the help of Lisa POSLUNS' address book, DIXON collects close to 200 buccal swabs of DNA. They are sent for analysis. Meanwhile, the lab comes up with another lead. They find a match for the print found in the utility room.
The thumbprint was the owner of the company with a contract to clean the building. He had a criminal record. He had keys for the building. He had access 24 hours a day to the building.
He tells police he had nothing to do with Lisa's murder. Finally, he agrees to give a sample. While they wait for the DNA test results, police contact Lisa's bank to see if there has been any recent activity on her missing credit cards.
By doing this, we established that nobody had used these cards for any advantage.
Police discount robbery as a motive. The DNA results come in. Not one of them is a match. Not Nam Lakins, not the owner of the cleaning company.
The fact that his thumbprint was so closely associated with the crime scene was written off to the fact that he had a good reason to be in that area of the building. It was becoming evident to us that the person that committed this crime was not someone who had any kind of close, regular contact with her.
With the trail growing cold, police will have to dig deeper if they're going to catch Lisa POSLUNS' killer. The investigation into the sexual assault and murder of Lisa POSLUNS hinges on DNA found on her clothes. Police have collected close to 200 DNA samples. None of them match. Police turn to behavioral profiler Jim Van Allen for help.
We basically try and answer the questions: who would do this to this victim at this time, at this location, in this manner?
A sexual assault that escalates to murder reveals something about Lisa's killer.
This offender would likely have been convicted and probably served a considerable period of incarceration for previous sexual assaults. He decided that he would not leave a live victim around to testify against him again.
Something else about the murder stands out to Van Allen.
The utility room wasn't known to exist by a lot of people. It suggested to me that the offender had more than just a casual familiarity with the building. Also, the work boot footprint was out of place given the character of Yorkville. Seemed to me to indicate that the offender likely had the background in maintenance work.
Helen Dixon goes back to 94 Cumberland to speak to the owner of the cleaning company. She wants the name of every man who worked for him in the last year.
He seemed to be less than 100% cooperative. He didn't know how to spell any of his employees' names, didn't know their addresses.
Finally, he remembers someone he let go a few months before the murder, when he discovered the man had a record for sexual assault.
He gave me the name Nelson DeJesus. Didn't really know how to spell it for sure.
Dixon checks various spellings of Nelson DeJesus. She gets a hit.
Nelson DeJesus's criminal record was extensive. There was convictions for sexual assault and, I believe, sexual assault with a weapon. This person, Nelson DeJesus, ran a very high risk of reoffending in a sexual or violent manner.
Dixon learns DeJesus is now doing custodial work at a Toronto hospital.
Detective Constable Dixon is a younger officer than I am, female, and less experienced. Yet I wanted her to run the interview with Nelson DeJesus.
I was a little bit apprehensive, never having spoken to a murder suspect before, but Inspector Grady gave me some very clear instructions, and those instructions were that I was to conduct this interview like I'd done all my other interviews when requesting a consent DNA sample.
Dixon explains the consent form to DeJesus.
The very last thing on the consent form is, do you want to talk to a lawyer? And at this time, Nelson said, well, can I talk to a lawyer? So I said, of course you can talk to your lawyer first. And it was at that point that Inspector Grady took over the interview.
I looked at him and I asked him, did you kill Lisa POSLUNS? And his response was, I hardly knew her. People have wanted to start a fight with me over me asking them if they killed somebody, but he was very cool, calm, and just avoided the answer.
Dixon tells DeJesus to call her after he speaks to his lawyer.
I shook his hand again when we left, and I noticed that there was a big change in his handshake. It was very sweaty and cold and clammy, which it really wasn't at the beginning.
When we left the building, I turned to Helen and I said, we have got to be on him 24/7 from now on. We put surveillance on him because if he's the one, I don't want to see anybody else injured.
Dixon requests the evidence from DeJesus' prior rape conviction.
There were 2 boxes of evidence from his 1995 trial. In those boxes of evidence was a report telling us that Nelson DeJesus' DNA was still on file.
Dixon wants the Center of Forensic Sciences to compare his DNA to the DNA found on Lisa POSLUNS' clothing. 2 days later, DNA results come in. It's a match.
Once the match was made, we decided immediately to arrest Nelson DeJesus. Unfortunately, they picked up the wrong person. It's quite easy for officers to misidentify a male, white, 6 foot in downtown Toronto.
Meanwhile, Constable DIXON examines items seized from DeJesus' locker at the hospital. His work boots grab her attention.
We had a number of photocopies of the bloody footprints that had been left at the crime scene. And I turned over the shoe and I looked at it compared to this photocopy, and I went, wow. I'm no trained footwear specialist, but it looked like a match to me. The night that we wanted to arrest Nelson DeJesus, I went home and I parked in an underground in my building. Knowing that he was out there, I looked around before I got out of my car. About the only time in my life that I've been afraid in Toronto was that evening.
We put out a Canada-wide warrant now for his arrest, and we want him located as soon as possible. We're quite concerned that he might be out there doing another crime.
Police surveillance has lost the prime suspect in the brutal rape and murder of real estate agent Lisa POSLUNS. Detective Grady leads a team of officers to Nelson DeJesus' house.
In order to get into the house, we had to break the door in, so there was some damage to the door. However, there was nobody at home.
Grady assigns 2 officers to remain at the house overnight.
My detail was to protect a scene where a search warrant had been executed. So we were preparing ourselves for a very, very long evening of what I call hurry up and wait. You go to a scene and just wait. So we're sitting down and watching television. I heard a creak at the door, and then it closed. I figured if it was actually a police officer, they'd more than likely knock. I screamed out to him, "Nelson, stop, police." I've drawn my pistol on him and I'm screaming at him at the top of my lungs. "Get down on the ground, you're under arrest." He's standing there with his arm over the fence and he had this strange look on his face, and I can only interpret it as he was probably thinking about killing me. And I can remember thinking to myself that I was going to have to shoot this guy. My partner arrives and he now has his gun pointed at him as well. And he screams to him, "Get down on the ground or I will kill you." And when he screams that, it would appear as though he chose life over death and got down on the ground. He said, "What am I under arrest for?" And I said, "Murder," just like that. It actually felt good to say it.
After the arrest, police retrieve DeJesus' satchel. Inside, they find what they call a rape kit. DeJesus' obsession with Lisa POSLUNS began months before when he was working at 94 Cumberland. On the night of the murder, DeJesus made his way in through an unsecured entrance. He waited for Lisa in a storage room not far from her office. He abducted her on her way to the washroom and took her to the most remote part of the building. In a cruel power game, DeJesus allowed Lisa to get dressed. Then he made sure there would be no live witness left to testify against him. He grabbed her purse and fled the scene. The DNA found on Lisa POSLUNS' clothing during the first 72 hours of the investigation was the crucial link to Nelson DeJesus.
Lisa was a vibrant, healthy, vivacious individual. If it weren't for a madman who wanted to rape her and end her life, she would still be alive.
The fact that it could happen to anybody, I think, is what I find scary about this case in particular. There's just no way of guarding yourself against someone like Nelson DeJesus.
Nelson DeJesus pleaded not guilty and refused to testify during his trial. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case.